A dog interrupted her funeral and uncovered a secret that shattered the whole town. It was the kind of day where the sky itself seemed too heavy to lift, cloaked in thick, unmoving clouds that made everything beneath it feel hushed, heavy, held hostage by grief, and a soft wind stirred the trees outside St. Bridget's chapel, the sound of rustling leaves mingling with the somber murmurs of mourners dressed in black as the village of Maryhill gathered to say farewell to one of its most treasured souls, Hannah Whitmore, the woman whose garden had always bloomed first in spring, whose voice had read to children at the library every Tuesday afternoon, whose pies had won blue ribbons at the county fair for the past 12 years, and whose sudden death had shaken the small town, leaving behind questions no one dared ask aloud. Cloaked in the comfortable lie of natural causes, with her casket resting at the front of the chapel, draped in white lilies and framed by photographs of a life well lived, while Father Michael stood beside it, hands folded, eyes lowered, the picture of composed reverence. But it was Duke who disrupted everything the Labrador mix, old but sharp, who bounded into the center aisle with an urgency that defied the weight of grief, barking once sharp and high, and the mourners turned in startled silence, then barking again, louder this time, paws scraping at the carpet as he ran toward the casket, drawing whispers that rippled through the pews because Duke had always been by Hannah's side, even in her final years, when arthritis kept her mostly on the porch, watching the world go by. And now he was clawing at the base of the casket, whining, barking again and again, his body tense with alarm, and someone whispered, "He's just confused," while another added, "It's the grief." But Duke wasn't confused, his eyes were fixed, his tail low, and when he paused to let out a low, guttural growl, it wasn't grief, it was warning. And standing at the back was a man few people in Maryhill knew well, David Lane. A quiet newcomer, a writer who had moved into the Whitmore guest house last autumn after renting it from Hannah herself. And she had been kind, a bit mysterious, strangely careful with her words when speaking about Father Michael, which David had always chalked up to small-town drama, until now. As something about Duke's behavior scratched at the back of his mind like a memory trying to surface, and he stepped out from the row of pews, making his way down the aisle slowly, kneeling beside the dog and murmuring, "Easy, boy," while Duke turned and met David's eyes with an intensity that made the hair on his neck rise, before turning back to the casket and barking 3 short times, then lying down, flat, unmoving. And that was when a frail voice behind them gasped Hannah's sister, Judith, whispering, "He did that once, the night of the break-in. Hannah was hurt. He barked like that 3 times, then laid down in front of her. I didn't understand then. I think it means something's wrong." As David looked up at Father Michael, who now stood rigid at the pulpit, hands clenched, and said, "Father, I think something's wrong," prompting the priest to stiffen and respond. "Mr. Lane, this is neither the time nor the place." But David pressed, "She didn't just die, did she? You told everyone she passed in her sleep, but something doesn't add up." And Michael's face twitched. "How dare you question this woman's passing in front of her family?" But then, from the pews, a child's voice rang out innocent and piercing. "I saw someone in a priest robe go into her house that night. Late. It wasn't Mass night, I remember." And a hush fell over the church like a blanket, all eyes turning to Father Michael, whose jaw clenched so tightly his temples pulsed, muttering, "Children imagine things," though the color was gone from his face, while David walked to the casket, placed a hand gently on the lid, and glanced at Judith, who nodded slowly. "If Duke says something's wrong, then we owe it to her to listen." As Father Michael stepped forward, raising his voice, "This is outrageous. I forbid it." But David had already opened the lid, and inside, beneath the satin lining, was a small hidden seam, which Duke whimpered toward him and pawed at, prompting David to peel it back and find something tucked beneath a handkerchief, folded, stained dark brown with old blood. And the moment it met the air, Duke let out a long howl that filled the church with something primal and ancient, while Judith covered her mouth and breathed. "Oh, God." Hannah kept that near her. I never knew why. and Father Michael backed away a step, saying, "This proves nothing." But his voice had lost all conviction as David turned the cloth and said, "It smells like chemicals, not just blood, something else, something poisonous." And the service unraveled, with mourners murmuring questions boiling to the surface as David slipped away that evening, driven by something deeper than doubt. Returning to the church just before midnight, stepping through the warped side window Hannah had once shown him, and heading for the bell tower, rarely used, rarely cleaned, and filled with dust and shadows, until his flashlight caught something behind a cabinet, a phone bong, burnt orange, the same kind Hannah always carried in her apron pocket, and on it, a single saved voice message, which David played with trembling fingers. "If I don't wake up tomorrow, don't believe what he says. Ask about the real will. Don't let me die in silence." And the sound chilled him to his bones, the words confirming what Duke had tried to say. And later that evening, when David fed Duke as usual, the dog sniffed the bowl, took one bite, and collapsed, prompting David to scream and rush him to the vet, who confirmed it was neurotoxin, a fast-acting poison slipped into the food, but Duke survived, barely, and someone had tried to kill him, not because he was a dog, but because he was the last one who might still know the truth. And the next morning, David returned to Hannah's cottage, tore the place apart until he found an envelope wedged behind a photo of Hannah and another woman, with a note in shaky handwriting. "If someone finds this, ask Father Michael about his wife. Ask why she died after discovering a hidden account. Don't let it happen again." And David froze, because Michael's wife, long dead, mysterious circumstances, was the woman in the photo, Hannah's best friend. And it all connected now, because Hannah had known something and paid the price. And as David prepared to call the police, his phone rang a blocked number, and a voice, distorted and raspy, hissed, "Stop digging. You and that dog know too much. The real will must never be seen." Then silence. But David had gone too far to stop and called a lawyer instead, visiting the town archive and requesting Hannah Whitmore's legal records. And there it was, the real will signed, stamped, witnessed, filed, stating that everything would go not to the church, but to a local animal sanctuary Hannah had helped fund in secret. And when news broke, Father Michael disappeared overnight. The rectory found empty, his belongings gone, his car abandoned 2 counties over. But the damage was done, and David became the executor of the estate. With Duke fully recovered, returned to the porch he once guarded, and within months, the Hannah and Duke Sanctuary opened its doors, rescuing animals that had no voice. And the townspeople, once blind in grief, never forgot the day a dog barked 3 times and refused to let the truth be buried. The morning fog clung to the edges of Maryhill like a reluctant ghost, drifting slowly through empty alleys and dew-damp fields, wrapping the town in a hush that felt more like warning than calm. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral, since Duke's desperate barks gathered the illusion of peace, and since Father Michael had vanished without a trace. Yet something in the air still hung unfinished, like a door left half open in the wind. The Hannah and Duke Sanctuary was already rising from the old Whitmore property, a modest red brick house now surrounded by fenced paddocks, storage sheds, and a warm wooden barn where animals gathered under David's careful watch. Villagers had begun to stop by more frequently, bringing blankets, feed, and sometimes silence, unable to forget what had been unearthed. And yet, David couldn't rest. He tried to busy himself with chores, clearing leaves, patching fences, stacking food supplies, but his thoughts kept circling back to that voice on the phone, low and grainy, a threat soaked in certainty. "Stop digging. You and that dog know too much." The phone sat in his drawer, its screen cracked, the message deleted but echoing in his mind each time Duke stirred at night. The dog had recovered well, though he was more alert now, often growling softly at empty doorways or pacing near the bedroom window at midnight, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. David would lie awake, heart pounding, replaying every memory of Hannah's last few weeks. She had seemed fine, tired maybe, but sharp as ever. She had baked that rhubarb tart the night before, humming while slicing fruit, pausing only to stare out the window when the church bell rang unusually late. She hadn't said why it bothered her, only muttered, "Not tonight." Why now? David hadn't thought much of it then. Now it haunted him. There were still missing pieces. David returned to the church late one evening, parking his truck a block away and slipping through the rear alley behind the parish garden. The building was quiet, locked, but the side entrance had a warped window Hannah once showed him, barely secured with a latch. With a gentle push, it gave way. Inside, the air was stale, untouched since the day Father Michael disappeared. Dust floated in the stained glass light. The sanctuary was cold, echoing with the creaks of a structure abandoned too suddenly. David made his way to the office, opened drawers, leafed through sermon notes, donation records, baptism logs. Then something caught his attention in a worn, leather-bound book, handwritten notations in the margins beside the weekly expenses. One entry stood out: tithe redirected asset transfer to Haven Hill. See folder 12A. Restricted. David's pulse quickened. Haven Hill wasn't a person, it was a place. An old boarding home, long shut down after a scandal years ago involving financial mismanagement and elder neglect. Why would Hannah's church money be going there, and what was folder 12A? He searched frantically until he found a rusted filing cabinet pushed behind a stack of unused hymnals. Inside, marked with a single piece of faded masking tape, was 12A. Its contents were sparse, with one invoice for a large sum wired to a private account, a copy of a property deed, and an envelope sealed and unmarked. He opened it. Inside were photographs. Photos of Hannah and someone else, a woman in a hospital bed. Weak, eyes sunken, tubes in her arms. On the back of each photo was a date. The final one, labeled September 15, on final visit. That was 2 days before Hannah died. David sank into the old chair, mind reeling. The woman wasn't familiar at first, until he realized with a jolt it was Margaret Delaney, Father Michael's late wife. But she hadn't died years ago like everyone believed. She'd been alive, sick, hidden, and Hannah had been visiting her. The town had been told Margaret died of pneumonia in 2007, but these photos had timestamps from 2 months ago, which meant he barely made it back to the truck. Gripping the steering wheel as the weight of the truth threatened to pull him under. Hannah had discovered Margaret was still alive, possibly cared for in secret at Haven Hill. Maybe Margaret had discovered something about Michael, his misuse of church funds, his manipulation, his lies. Maybe she tried to tell someone. Maybe Hannah was the only one who listened. The dots connected too fast, too violently. Hannah had found Margaret. Hannah had threatened exposure. And someone, perhaps not acting alone, had ensured both women would never speak again. David didn't sleep that night. He sat beside Duke, who rested his chin on David's knee, eyes watchful. At dawn, he packed a small bag, filled a thermos, and drove north toward the location of Haven Hill. The facility was no longer in operation, but its bones still stood, an aging, boarded structure wrapped in rusting chain-link fence. No sign, no path, no security, only silence. David parked at the edge of the woods and approached on foot. The back door was partially unhinged. The interior smelled of bleach and mold. He moved slowly, flashlight in hand, stepping over broken gurneys and abandoned medical carts. The room at the far end had a paper sign taped to it, DLM Private. He opened it. The room was empty now, mattress stripped, drawers open. But taped to the wall was a single slip of paper, held by a dull tack. On it, a scribbled message: "Tell Hannah the file is in the ledger, behind the old hymn book." He's lying. David stepped back. It was a message meant to be found, but perhaps never was, and it confirmed it. Margaret had been trying to speak, to share something buried deeper than even David imagined. He returned to Maryhill with one mission: to find the ledger. Back at the church, he returned to the pulpit, the hymnal shelf beneath it long unused, behind a row of dusty books. One was thicker, unmarked. Inside was a sealed folder labeled simply "Rent Account." Inside was a paper trail: fund transfers, falsified documents, offshore banking forms, and one letter, typed, unsigned: "If this ever surfaces, they'll turn on me. I only did what was necessary. She wanted to expose everything Margaret and the others, but the church needed silence, not scandal. Hannah was getting too close. You'll find this letter useless if you can't prove it. But by then, it'll be too late. There's no evidence left. Only shadows. David stood in the empty chapel, the file in one hand, rage in the other. No one else had to die. Not Hannah, not Margaret, and not the voice of truth. As the clock struck 6, Duke let out a long, low growl from the sanctuary doorway. David turned and froze. A man stood in the aisle. Trench coat, hat, silent, watching. Then he turned and walked away. David rushed after him, but by the time he reached the steps, the man was gone. No car, no footprints on the gravel path, only the breeze, and the open road stretching toward the woods. But something had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, full of names, full of secrets, and full of voices ready to be heard. The storm came in just after midnight, not with violence, but with a steady, creeping pressure like the slow breath of something beast watching, pressing against the windows of Maryhill, humming through the trees, brushing rooftops with wet leaves as the rain whispered its secrets into the ground. And inside the Whitmore cottage, David couldn't sleep, not with the folder still open on his table. Its contents spread across the worn wood like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted solved. Forged documents, wire transfers, falsified signatures, and that typed confession. Unsigned but undeniable. The line that kept circling back in his head like a fish in a tank too small to forget its own edges. She wanted to expose everything Margaret and the others, because what others? Who were they? And how many voices had been buried in that one word? And as the candle flickered low, Duke stirred at his feet, ears twitching, eyes darting toward the door as if some sound, imperceptible to human ears, had brushed past the frame and slipped through the cracks. And though David told himself it was wind, part of him knew better because they had already tried to kill the dog, and it was only a matter of time before they tried again. And maybe this time, they wouldn't miss. So when the rain slowed to a whisper and the sky turned the pale gray of false dawn, he returned to the church, not for the records or the confession, but for the space itself, the air inside, the places untouched by ceremony and memory, places that might still remember what people had tried to forget. And he brought Duke with him because silence was always easier to face when someone loyal walked beside you, even if that someone couldn't speak. And the church greeted them the way all old buildings did, with echoes, chill, and the faint, persistent scent of wood and wax and something else buried beneath it all. And David walked past the pews, past the pulpit, into the vestry, scanning the walls with slow, deliberate hands, checking behind dusty hymnals and beneath warped floorboards, searching not for answers but for the place where the questions had been sealed shut. And Duke led the way without hesitation, nose to the floor, ears rigid, tail straight, until he stopped beside a thick wooden crossbeam where the altar rail met the wall, and with a low, steady growl, pressed his nose to the wood, unmoving. And David crouched beside him, running his fingers along the beam until he found it one spot smoother than the rest, untouched by dust, warmed by touch. And when he pressed it, there was a soft click, followed by a subtle shift, and a small square of wood swung open, revealing a recess in the wall no larger than a shoebox. And inside, wrapped in cloth and tied with a faded blue ribbon, lay a leather-bound notebook and a rusted metal key that felt ice-cold in David's palm. And he opened the book with trembling fingers, the scent of old ink rising like breath from between the pages. And there it was, Hannah's handwriting, shaky but precise. "If you found this, then I've failed." And the words struck like a bell in the quiet, echoing deep into his chest. And the next line read, "I tried to make it right quietly. I thought I could fix it without blood. But they came after Margaret, and now I think they'll come for me. There's something underneath the church. Ask Bellamy if he's still alive." And David shut the book slowly, heart pounding, because Jim Bellamy had been the church groundskeeper decades ago, long before Father Michael arrived. A man David had only seen once in town, gray-bearded, quiet, living in the forest on the edge of civilization. And if he was still alive, He might hold the final piece of the truth. So David left the church that morning with the key in his pocket, the journal clutched to his chest, and by midday, he was standing outside a crooked cabin nestled in the pines, smoke trailing from a bent chimney, birds scattering from the porch railing as Duke barked once and the screen door creaked open. And there he was, Bellamy stooped, hollow-eyed and unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting David all along, and without a word, he motioned him inside, poured 2 mugs of something bitter and herbal, and said, "She told me someone would come. Never said it'd be you." And David nodded once, then asked the only question that mattered, "What's underneath the church?" And Bellamy exhaled through his teeth, stared into his mug, then said, "Something old, something no one was supposed to find again." And slowly, he began to speak, not with fear, but with the weariness of someone who'd carried too many names for too long. And he told David about 1979 when Maryhill was poor, cut off, ruled quietly by the church's hand, and a special fund called the Ledger had been created to support psychological renewal for troubled youth, though what it truly supported was a secret program hidden beneath the altar, one that used seclusion, behavioral manipulation, and sometimes chemical sedation on children labeled disruptive, children who had no families, or who had no one left to protect them. And Bellamy had found the basement by accident, looking for a lost delivery crate, and what he saw scratched walls, restraints. The silence haunted him for decades, and he tried to report it once, but the priest back then died in a fire 3 weeks later, and the assistant vanished. And Bellamy stayed quiet, told himself it had ended, until Margaret started asking questions. And then Hannah, and he warned them both, but they kept digging, and then both were gone, and now here was David, key in hand, and the cycle had begun again. And when David asked if the room still existed, Bellamy nodded and slid a hand-drawn map across the table, marked with a red X behind the altar, and said, "There's a switch under the second candle holder. Press it. The door will find you." And he warned David that whatever was down there wasn't just darkness, it was memory. And memory doesn't die just because people do. And that night, when the sky blackened and the wind rose like it had a voice, David returned to the church alone, lit a single candle, walked to the altar, placed his hand beneath the brass holder, and felt the switch click beneath his fingers. And with a soft shudder, a seam in the wall opened, narrow and black as a sealed mouth, and he stepped inside, the candlelight flickering against the cold stone steps that curved downward like a throat swallowing secrets. And Duke followed without hesitation, their steps the only sound in the dark. Until they reached the door, a rusted slab of metal, ancient and humming, and David inserted the key, felt it turn with a grinding sigh, and the door opened to a room that felt not just hidden, but abandoned by time itself. Square, windowless, silent, with a metal cot, a table, chains embedded in the wall, and along the concrete surface, hundreds of faint scratches, some names, some symbols, and one word carved again and again in every corner. "Listen," and he did, holding his breath as he crossed the room and saw an old tape recorder sitting on the desk, dusty but intact. And when he pressed play, a child's voice crackled through the speaker, trembling and faint. "I did what they said. I didn't scream. Please don't forget me." And David fell to his knees, the candle flickering violently, his stomach twisting as the weight of every hidden child pressed into his chest. And as he stood again, eyes brimming, he took photos, took the tape, took the names, and climbed the stairs slowly, locking the hatch behind him. But even as he emerged into the sanctuary's dim light, he felt it that something had climbed with him, something that no longer belonged to the basement. And he knew now, without doubt, this was no longer about exposing the past. It was about stopping what had never truly ended. The air above ground felt different, as if passing through that hidden stairwell had altered something fundamental in David's perception of the world, or perhaps in the world itself. And though Maryhill appeared unchanged on the surface, with its mailboxes creaking open, morning coffee brewing, and children walking to school in yellow raincoats, everything now carried the invisible weight of what David had discovered beneath the church. Something stitched together from forgotten names, sealed rooms, and whispers that had been silenced for decades but never erased. And as he sat at his desk with the recorder in his hands, headphones pressed to his ears, listening over and over to the trembling child's voice saying, "Please don't forget me. I did what they said. I stayed quiet, but it still hurt." He realized this wasn't just evidence of abuse or corruption. It was a cry from the past demanding to be heard, and it echoed in every breath David took, growing louder with each beat of his heart, while Duke lay nearby, still and watchful, lifting his head now and then as if reacting to a presence David couldn't see but could certainly feel. And by 2 a.m., he couldn't bear the quiet anymore. So he returned to the church with camera, notebook, the tape, and the ledger in hand, leaving Duke behind this time to keep him safe, though something in the Wissy's eyes seemed to plead otherwise. And once inside, the sanctuary greeted him like a waiting tomb, its flickering stained glass colors casting moving shadows that danced eerily along the walls as he approached the hidden panel behind the altar, pressed the candle switch, and stepped down into the cold stone stairwell for the third time, his candle trembling in his grip as the door groaned open and the air hit him thick, stale, filled with the scent of mildew, dust, and something older than either. And as he swept the flashlight slowly across the concrete room, his breath caught because now, in the beam, he saw something he'd missed before names, dozens of them, scratched faintly into the plaster walls like fingernails dragged in desperation. Some neat and small, some erratic, angry, chaotic. Names like Sarah, Mikey, Thomas, Joe, Ellie, some with last names, others just first, a few underlined, a few crossed out, one even etched with shaky capital letters beside a tiny handprint. And he didn't know who they were yet, but they had been here, their presence carved into the stone itself, a memorial no one was meant to see. And as he turned toward the cot, something caught his eye, a dull shimmer near the floor beneath the dust, which he knelt to uncover and found to be a small, tarnished medallion worn at the edges, the face of St. Gabriel barely visible, and on the back, faint but legible. The engraving returned me to MD. Yeah, and his blood ran cold because Margaret Delaney had been here, and this was hers, maybe dropped, maybe placed, but unmistakably hers, confirming that she'd been involved more deeply than anyone knew. Maybe as a caregiver, maybe as a witness, maybe even as a whistleblower silenced before her story could be heard. And just as that thought passed, the recorder clicked, again, though he hadn't touched it, and a new voice played. Older, male, cracking with time. It won't stay quiet forever, the walls remember. If they find this, burn it, with the timestamp August 1981, which made David stagger backward and grip the edge of the cot because now the room wasn't just soaked in memory. It was alive with it, filled with voices and warnings from a buried past. And the moment grew too heavy to bear. So he climbed the stairs, resealed the hatch, stepped into the sanctuary, and collapsed into a pew, staring up at the cross, whispering, "How deep does it go? How many knew?" And that question sent him into a week-long spiral of investigation where he cross-referenced every name he photographed on those walls with school archives, newspaper clippings, baptism records, and even cemetery logs. And what he found hollowed him out. Many names belonged to children reported missing, others to children who had allegedly moved away, a few to those who had been institutionalized for reasons never publicly disclosed. And one name stood out like a cracked bone in soft flesh: Thomas Gellard. Last seen in Maryhill in 1984, reported missing at age 12. Never found. And yet scratched into the wall below a symbol that looked like an hourglass split in two. And through days of tracking, David located Thomas's older sister Marion, now living 2 towns over, and contacted her under the guise of historical research. And they met at a diner off Route 6 where she sat stiffly at first, arms crossed, wary, but when David mentioned the church, her hands trembled around her coffee mug, and she whispered, "You're not the first to ask." But most stop after the first time, and when he asked what she meant, she told him how Thomas had come home with bruises, how he said he fell, how his smile faded week by week, and how one day he vanished without so much as a note. And when she begged for help, Father Michael told her to grieve and forget, said she was imagining things. And when David slid a printed photo of the basement wall across the table, with her brother's name circled in red, she froze, eyes wide with tears, and said, "He was real. They tried to erase him," and then, with trembling fingers, she handed David a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with time, and in Margaret's familiar handwriting were the words, "They're hiding something beneath the altar. A room, a record, a ledger of silence." And David felt the floor shift beneath him, not physically but morally, because now he knew Margaret had tried, had reached out, and been ignored. And now the burden passed to him, and when he returned to the sanctuary that night, hoping to work alone, he found the front door slightly ajar, though he remembered locking it, and inside, nothing was disturbed except the pulpit, where on the lectern sat one of the very wall photographs he had taken enlarged, printed, with a single red line slashing through the name David Lane and beneath it, scrawled in rough handwriting. The question the walls already know. Do you? And his blood turned to ice as he turned around, heart pounding, convinced someone was watching, but there was no one there. Only the still air and the distant creak of wood settling. And that night he didn't sleep, sitting with Duke beside the fireplace, clutching the medallion in one hand and the recorder in the other, whispering aloud to himself that if anything happened, someone needed to know. And he recorded a message listing names, connections, timelines, then sent it to 3 encrypted backups on delayed release. And the next day, when Marion called to tell him about a former archivist named Ulrich Maury, who vanished in 1980 after reportedly discovering something he refused to burn. It all clicked the priest before Michael died in a fire. The assistant left town. Margaret died quietly, Hannah in her sleep, and now Ulrich missing. And the pattern became undeniable every time someone got close. They vanished or were painted as unstable. And that afternoon, when David stepped outside to feed the animals and found fresh footprints in the wet soil leading to the barn and stopping mid-track as if the person simply vanished, he knew they were watching again. And the following morning, when a package arrived at his door unmarked, unaddressed, inside a cassette tape and a note saying, "You want names?" Listen carefully. He played it with shaking hands and heard Father Michael's voice. Calm and clinical ledger log, September 10th, 1983, child number 27, compliant, minimal resistance, procedure complete, followed by another voice. Unfamiliar and cold, erase file, burn signature, and David dropped the recorder, every hair on his arm standing straight, because now he understood the ledger wasn't just financial, it was human. And they hadn't just hidden money, they had hidden what they did to children. And they did it beneath a church, in a room of silence. And that silence had been broken. The night before David made his decision, he stood beneath the sycamore tree outside the Hannah and Duke sanctuary and watched the branches tremble in the wind like 1,000 whispering hands trying to tell him to stop. Turn back, forget. But it was too late for forgetting. Too late for pretending silence was safety, because everything had shifted the moment he heard the child's voice from that recorder. The moment he saw the names carved into concrete. The moment he found the room that wasn't supposed to exist. And now the truth wasn't just something he'd uncovered. It was something that lived with him, breathed with him, slept beside him, its weight heavier than any guilt he'd ever known. And as he leaned against the wooden post and looked out over the sanctuary where Duke lay curled near the barn door, peacefully unaware that his name had once been scribbled on a kill order by men who feared even a dog could expose them, David felt a storm inside him that no weather could match. Because while he had evidence, voices, names, timelines, and even a witness in Marion Gellard who'd gone public in a shaky YouTube video that morning with the words, "My brother was one of them," and they erased him. None of it had stopped what was coming, and he knew it when he woke up that morning to find the sanctuary gates pried open. The supply shed scorched, and a single word painted on the wall in red enough. And it wasn't just a warning, it was a deadline. And he had until nightfall to choose whether to go quiet or go loud. And he chose loud, not with a scream, but with a broadcast. So that afternoon he met with Ben Alcott, a local journalist whose reputation for chasing corruption had earned him both awards and enemies. And David handed him everything: the tape recordings, the map, the ledger, the medallion marked MD, the photos of the basement, the confession letter, the file marked rent account, and most importantly, the audio clip of Father Michael's voice, child number 27, compliant, procedure complete. And Ben, pale but determined, said, "We'll air it at midnight." And David nodded, not because it felt like victory, but because it felt like the last thing he could give those children whose names had been forgotten, whose cries were buried in a room designed not for salvation, but for silence. And he returned to the church one final time with Duke trotting beside him, not out of habit, but because something in the bond had changed too, as if he now understood the battle wasn't just for justice, it was for memory. And when they stepped inside, the sanctuary was darker than usual, even with the sun still high, the stained glass casting long, bleeding streaks of color across the pews. And David moved quickly to the altar, lit the last candle, pressed the hidden switch, and descended those stairs like a soldier entering a tomb, not to fight, but to listen. Because he had missed something, something he felt more than knew. And when the hatch creaked open and the room swallowed him once again, he heard it: not a sound, not exactly, but a presence, a stillness that spoke. And this time, he didn't just walk the perimeter or photograph names. He sat down on the cot and closed his eyes. And as his breathing slowed, he reached for the old recorder, turned it over, and noticed a symbol he hadn't seen before, a star etched beneath the battery panel. And when he removed it, there was a tape inside he hadn't played. No label, no date, just a dull black ribbon coiled like a secret, too scared to speak. And when he clicked play, he didn't hear a voice at first, just static, then breathing, then a whisper. "They think we don't remember, but the walls do. And now you do too. Tell them we're still here. Tell them we never left." And then a pause, followed by the unmistakable voice of Hannah, tired but sharp. "If this is found, it means I couldn't stop it. But someone will. And if that someone is you, then you're not alone." And David felt his heart crack in two, because she had known, she had planned, and she had chosen him. Not by accident, but because she saw something in him worth trusting with the truth. And when he turned off the tape and stood up, the room seemed quieter, as if it had finally been heard. And he whispered, "I won't let them bury you again." Then climbed the stairs one final time, sealing the hatch behind him, not to hide it, but to preserve it, because the evidence would soon be public, and the world would know. And as he stepped into the nave, he saw a figure standing by the entrance, silhouetted in the fading light, wearing a coat too heavy for spring. And David froze, then walked forward slowly, recognizing the posture, the stillness. And when the figure stepped closer, the face was unmistakable. Father Michael, older, thinner, haunted. His eyes not angry but resigned, and he said, "You really found it all, didn't you?" And David said, "They already know." And Michael nodded, glancing around the church like he was saying goodbye to a memory, then whispered, "I only did what they taught me to do. I was a child too once. I never left this building." "Not really." And David said, "But you made sure no one else ever could." And Michael looked down, then reached into his coat, pulled out a small wooden box, and handed it over, saying, "They told me to burn it. I couldn't." And when David opened it, inside was a list: names, dates, numbers, details, and index of every child who had ever been processed through the ledger. And at the bottom, one last line: total admitted 43. Survivors known to. And David said, "This is the end." And Michael said, "It's the beginning." Then turned and walked out into the twilight, vanishing down the steps without another word. And David never saw him again. And at midnight, when the story aired, when the voices were played, when the photographs appeared on screens across the state, Maryhill was no longer quiet, and the sanctuary gates were flooded with reporters, protesters, and people holding candles with names written on them, names scratched into concrete, names once erased, now spoken. And David stood beside Duke, holding the medallion in his hand, feeling the silence finally break, not with a scream, but with a collective breath from a community ready to remember. And when asked what justice meant to him, David didn't talk about courtrooms or prison. He simply said, "Justice is listening when others weren't allowed to speak." And from that day on, the Hannah and Duke Sanctuary wasn't just a haven for animals, it became a memorial, a place where voices long buried were read aloud every week, where names were painted on the walls in gold, and where one loyal dog sat near the entrance, tail still, eyes steady, guarding not the gates, but the memory of every soul who had ever been told to disappear. And the last plaque ever added simply read, "Some truths are too loyal to stay hidden."